So I have a habit of going back to webtoons that have been adapted to live actions and comparing them. Whilst I was doing that, I kept noticing that Rashta was being named in the comments that have nothing to do with the Remarried Empress. I began to wonder, why is she hated to that degree? And is it justified? I decided to go back with a new perspective, and honestly, my opinion of Rashta truly changed. So our first panel in the whole story containing Rashta depicts her as a two-faced, deceptive person. This panel alone is the root cause for all the further hatred towards Rashta. Before our protagonist, Navier, I'm going to call it Navier, meets Rashta, she is already fed with dirty and low-life images of her, as her ladies-in-waiting were describing this new girl who was brought into the castle. This gives Rashta an unfair chance, as before we, as the readers, or even Navier meets her, she's already being depicted as a lowlife and she's looked down by the nobles. By the second chapter, Navier is under the impression that Rashta is a slave. Navier says, I was told that you found a slave during your hunting trip and then brought her back. And Sovashu's first response is, where did you hear that from? As we can see, there is a literal gap between their marriage as they're sitting far apart, and we also learn that they only have dinner once a week. And you're telling me you're not happy Rashta saved Navier from this lousy husband? I hate him. He should be he is the antagonist. I'm just saying, I don't like Sovashu one bit, and I don't see why he doesn't get as much hate as Rashta. Sovashu assures Navier that she was just a girl that was caught in one of their traps and was brought back to be nursed back to health. Naturally, using the word slave is kind of controversial, so in a way to soften it, the writer states that people only become slaves if they committed a crime or if they're very unlucky and your ancestors committed a crime on your behalf, so you still have to pay for it. And in this case, it applies to Rashta, where her father is the one who committed fraud. She ends up paying the negative price for the first of many men in her life. But, and there is a but, every year a number of slaves are able to move up in the hierarchy and become mere commoners. But only a number of them, because we can't be freeing all of them. Someone's got to be working on the fields, if you get what I'm saying. Unfortunately, though, this privilege is never allowed for runaway slaves. Runaway slaves are treated just as if they've committed a crime and are treated like fugitives. So, Rashta has absolutely no chance of becoming even a commoner if they find out she's a slave, number one. And number two, the fact that she's a runaway slave and even there to try and make her life better, she cannot be granted a commoner status. She is a criminal. So you can understand why she will end up taking desperate measures to get to certain places. Obviously, at the start, we don't know this information just yet, but we can assume that she is some sort of slave because they keep on insinuating she is, and the fact that they brought up this information leads us to believe that she is a slave. Looking at this objectively, we find many characters from many different stories who have done everything in any means possible to get out of poverty, even just to get a bit of money for your family. For example, Breaking Bad, where Walter White does end up doing a lot of bad things. We do understand why he does it, and we aren't so quick to call him evil. You know, he's just trying to make money for his family before he dies. Just sort of the case for Rashta, she's trying to survive, but we don't give her any leeway, especially at the beginning where she hasn't actually done anything just yet that has made us as a reader have any reason to be angry with her. Navier further states that no matter what the king does in his own country, Rashta will never be able to debut into high society. She will always be a slave to Navier and all the readers, since that's all she's been called, even though, according to the king, she was just a girl who was injured. And I do find that interesting because I see a lot of theories saying, oh, if Rashta met Navier first, Navier would have helped her out and she wouldn't have been in that awful position and wouldn't have been making all of these bad decisions. But I don't believe that for 1 second. We clearly see how she is treated before they even meet her, even have a notion of how she is. It's already been called filth and a slave. What if Rashta really was just a girl who got caught in the trap and happened to be a slave, and Navier ended up treating her exactly how she did now? She wouldn't have helped her. She would have just treated her as she is, a slave. which isn't a criticism necessarily on Navier since she is the Empress. She's going to treat people who are below her on the social status as below her. Their first encounter is very important because Rashta excitingly says hello and hi to the Empress, and there's flowers and she has a big smile, and Navier ignores her. So naturally she goes again and says, hey you. Navier is shocked. She's like, did she just address the Empress like me with hey you? And I'm going to be completely honest. When I first read this, when I was 14, I was like, how dare this girl come up to the Empress and talk to her as if she's her mate? Who does she think she is? She is a lowlife. She's a slave. Who does this homewrecker, because we know this from the first panel, who does she think she is? But critically speaking, Rashta's clearly not used to high society. She doesn't even know how to address nobles. She can't even read or write. So it's not surprising that she just says, hey you. She doesn't say your majesty. She doesn't curtsy or whatever they're meant to do. So why do we expect her to know the customs? Obviously we don't know. She doesn't know how to read or write. But we know she's a slave from all the clues they've been giving us. Navier's reaction is somewhat valid because it doesn't make sense why Navier wouldn't be used to someone addressing her as that, especially since a girl who she has never met is just addressing her almost inappropriately since she is the Empress. So her reaction is somewhat valid. But us as a reader who do not live in this world and are not empresses should be able to grasp why someone like Rashta wouldn't be able to understand all of these customs. So wouldn't we not be a little bit more lenient when we're talking about her in the comments? I want to make an edit of Trasha, but her hair is replaced with a plastic bag. When the 304 has the audacity to speak to the wife, you're the ugly side piece. I hate Rashta. I want to slap Trashta's face every time I see her. And I honestly don't blame the comments because, like I said, when I was 14, I was exactly like that. But if you think about it from the start, Rashta was deemed as a character beneath everyone else. A literal slave that's below everyone else. That's the lowest of lows. And someone who's not worthy of your time or mine. So why are we surprised that when you're molded into something, you end up turning into that in the final product? Rashta ends up becoming this insufferable character because of how she is treated around her. Even now, this is an integral reason why Rashta ends up despising Navier. If you do try and see it from her perspective, which is something I never done while reading hundreds of episodes until I reached maybe 163, Rashta is getting the opportunity of a lifetime, not only meeting the emperor of the kingdom that she is enslaved under, but also the Empress. Who wouldn't try and talk to the Empress and possibly get on their good side? While trying to stop Navier from leaving, Rashta grabs onto her dress, ends up ripping the dress, and then she states, sorry, I wanted to call out to you, but I didn't know what to call you. I don't know why I gave her sort of an accent, but anyways, now Navier is shocked that Rashta knew she was the Empress, which is understandable since from birth she was raised just to be the Empress. So she would look at people who are in different classes as how they are, different parts of society. But this does show how large the division between the rich and the commoners are. And in Rashta's case, his slave, which should make us understand why Rashta isn't necessarily in the position to even understand the customs due to that wide division. But do I expect the average Remarried Empress viewer to read that deep into it? Absolutely not. But it is interesting though, and it is another reason why Rashta as a character so far at this specific episode, because I'm going to turn on her later, but why in this specific episode, she isn't necessarily completely in the wrong, or at least deserving of all the criticism that she gets in the comments. Navier puts two and two together, assuming she didn't know before, and says, oh, yeah, the slave, in a somewhat condescending tone. So you're telling me that being called a slave, which means that the ancestors of you, or you yourself, are a criminal, is not a tiny bit condescending, especially since her own husband reassured her that she isn't a slave, and in fact just a girl who has been caught in one of their traps. Navier does eventually just let it go, because she says she's not, so there's no reason to quabble over it, which is the mature and understandable thing to do. Rashta's exclaiming how happy she is to have met her because she wanted to say hello, and Navier is rightfully confused why she wanted to say hello to her, and she says it's because she'll be seeing them more, and she thought she should introduce herself. Obviously, Navier's a bit confused as to why they would be seeing more of each other. And Rashta does ask once more, what should I call you? And Navier rightfully draws the line and says, call me Her Majesty. This response is valid since she clearly wants to draw a line between her and Rashta and isn't interested in making any relationships with her in the first place. So she decides to make Rashta call her what every other person but the king would call her. Or her family, I guess. And it's Her Majesty, the Empress. Navier then sees no point to this discussion and leaves. While Navier tries to leave, Rashta gets hit for saying, oh wait, and reaching her hand out because she's acting very familiar. Which is understandable why they are surprised at her very informal ways, but it is because she is a slave and clearly doesn't know how to act. Gets called a filthy wench by one of Navier's minions. Sofashu then comes out of nowhere and says, who are you calling a filthy wench? Dun dun dun! Sofashu then blatantly ignores his wife and goes to Rashta and asks, are you okay? Naturally, people are gonna say he's a terrible person. And when a terrible person helps someone, you're gonna call the person being helped a terrible person too. And I do believe this is the start of the hate towards Rashta. It's almost as if it's collateral damage for all of Sofashu's wrong actions. Person who is always actively hurting Navier is Sofashu. Don't get me wrong, it is also Rashta's some of the time. But he has a part in it because he is always the common denominator. It's always Sofashu. He then calms down Rashta and says, oh dear, don't cry. Didn't I just tell you to stop crying? Oh, I hate him. People took Rashta's crying as being two-faced and just being an attention seeker. But since I am playing devil's advocate, can we blame her? She was just called filth and was hit twice and was also being ignored by the Empress. And if they're an emotional person, naturally, we can't blame her for letting out a couple of tears and having a little cry about it. Sure, it is a bit of coincidence that it only started when the Emperor appeared, but she did get called filth. While Navier tries to leave, Silvershoe, I'm going to call him Silvershoe now, not Silvershoe because I don't like his name, stops Nora, the girl who called Rashta filthy. And Navier is perplexed. How could she be getting punished for something that she said to a low-life slave? How is someone's actions actually having consequences? I'm going to be honest, I don't remember the beginning of the story being like this at all. For some reason, I always remembered Rashta just being a conniving, two-faced person off rip. But we don't really see that in the first few episodes. Yeah, in the comments, it's filled with hateful towards Rashta just because of that first panel. That first smirk changed the whole story. And I understand it is foreshadowing, but I wonder what would have happened if we didn't get that in the first scene. Like, I am curious how the story would have progressed without people's perception of Rashta being a two-faced homewrecker. I would like to remind everyone that this isn't me defending every action that Rashta has done. She has done awful things, like that poor blue bird, if you know, you know. But, like I said, she is one of the villains and she should be treated as such. But I don't think she should be treated as the main antagonist. And she never really had a fighting chance to begin with. So this is the end of part 1. There is a part 2, which will talk more about how Rashta is actually a victim and how she fits into the characteristics that describe a victim. It would also mention how the effect of her father returning changed my personal opinion and many of the Remarried Empress's fans' opinions. I will also mention how Matty Bite's video made me a bit more open-minded to see how Rashta isn't just a 2D villain. She's a lot more complex than what I'm used to and what many other readers are used to. So if you're interested in how that is, then feel free to subscribe, like, comment. I feel like if this video reaches an audience, I literally have like one subscriber. The other one is myself and I. But if it does reach the right audience, and the comments, if there's any comments, it would probably be why Rashta's bad. And I understand that because, like I said, this isn't me defending every single thing she's done because she definitely does a lot more questionable and definitely evil stuff. But I do like looking at other people's point of views and thinking, well, what if she actually isn't that bad? But I would never do that for Silver.